Everyone thinks medieval battles were about honor and glory, but I just discovered what really happened in those final hours beforehand. It's so twisted that historians barely mention it, and when you hear what these noble warriors were actually doing, you'll never see them the same way again. You know what's absolutely wild? Before a single sword was swung or arrow fired, medieval armies had to deal with something that would make modern HR departments weep: gathering troops from scratch. No phone calls, no emails, just pure chaos. Heralds would gallop across the countryside like medieval Uber Eats drivers, except instead of delivering food, they were delivering death sentences. These poor guys had to ride from village to village, shouting royal proclamations that basically said, "Hey, drop everything and maybe die for your lord." Talk about a tough gig. The whole process could take weeks. Knights from different regions would trickle in like guests arriving fashionably late to a dinner party, except this party involved significantly more potential dismemberment. Some came from lands so far away they'd never even seen their supposed leader before. Makes you wonder how awkward those first meetings were. But here's the kicker. This seemingly chaotic system actually worked. Over 10,000 soldiers could be summoned for major campaigns. 10,000. That's like filling a small stadium with people willing to fight with pointy metal objects. The sheer logistics would give modern event planners nightmares. Communication relied entirely on messengers and designated signals. Smoke signals, horn blasts, and flag movements were their version of group chats. Imagine trying to coordinate your weekend plans using only smoke signals. Now, imagine doing it with an army's worth of people who might not even speak the same dialect. Different regions brought different fighting styles, weapons, and levels of enthusiasm. Some knights arrived in gleaming armor looking like they stepped out of a fairy tale. Others showed up with farming equipment and the fashion sense of someone who clearly got dressed in the dark. The diversity was both a strength and a massive headache for commanders. Then there's the loyalty issue nobody talks about. These weren't professional soldiers with contracts and benefits packages. Many were bound by feudal obligations that were about as clear as tax law. Some owed service to multiple lords, creating conflicts of interest that would make corporate lawyers rich. The whole system depended on honor, tradition, and the very real threat of having your land seized if you didn't show up. Nothing motivates attendance quite like the possibility of losing your castle. But gathering the troops was just the beginning of the madness. Once these medieval armies finally assembled, commanders faced an even bigger challenge: figuring out what to actually do with this mob of armed strangers. Now here's where things get interesting. And frankly, a lot more complicated than you'd expect. Medieval commanders didn't just wake up and decide to charge into battle. They spent days hunched over crude maps, moving little wooden pieces around like they were playing the world's deadliest board game. These weren't the detailed satellite images we have today. We're talking about rough sketches on parchment that made your kids' crayon drawings look like masterpieces. But don't underestimate these guys. They knew their stuff. The first rule? Know your ground better than your own backyard. A single hill could mean the difference between glorious victory and becoming crow food. Commanders would send scouts, often just regular soldiers with good eyesight, to study every rock stream and muddy patch for miles around. Why? Well, try explaining to your king why you lost 10,000 men because you didn't notice that swamp. Then came the real chess match, figuring out what the enemy was up to. Medieval intelligence gathering was basically organized gossip with higher stakes. Merchants, travelers, even prostitutes. Anyone who might have overheard something useful became a potential source. One tavern conversation could reveal whether your opponent had cavalry or just a bunch of farmers with pointy sticks. The smart commanders knew Sun Tzu had it right centuries earlier. Know your enemy and know yourself. Henry V didn't stumble into his famous victory at Agincourt by accident. His planners spent weeks analyzing French tactics, counting their knights, and studying how they moved. Turns out heavy cavalry doesn't work so well in mud. Who knew? But here's what really separated the winners from the losers. Understanding that battles were won before the first sword was drawn. The planning phase determined everything: troop positioning, supply lines, escape routes, even which direction to face so the sun wouldn't blind your archers at dawn. Medieval generals also had to juggle politics while planning war. That ally who promised 500 knights, he might show up with 50 farmers instead, or not show up at all if he decided switching sides looked more profitable. Smart commanders always had backup plans for their backup plans. The really clever ones even planned their propaganda campaigns. After all, what good is winning a battle if nobody hears the right version of the story? And speaking of stories, wait until you hear what these armies needed just to survive long enough to reach the battlefield. You know what's funny? We always think about medieval warriors charging into battle with gleaming swords and shining armor. But here's the thing nobody talks about. These guys had to eat. And boy, was that complicated. Medieval armies moved on their stomachs, just like Napoleon would say centuries later. Makes sense, right? Try swinging a 20-pound sword when you haven't eaten in 2 days. You'd probably fall over faster than a drunk knight at a wedding feast. The logistics were absolutely mind-boggling. We're talking about feeding thousands of hungry soldiers, sometimes for weeks at a time. A typical army of 10,000 men needed roughly 15,000 pounds of food every single day. That's like feeding a small town that's constantly on the move and always grumpy. Local villages got hit harder than a piñata at a kid's birthday party. Royal commanders would ride into town with official writs, basically fancy pieces of paper that said, "Give us your stuff or else." Farmers watched their grain stores disappear overnight. Their livestock gone faster than free beer at a tavern. The resentment was real. Imagine working all year just to have some lord's army clean out your pantry. But here's where it gets interesting. Smart commanders knew angry locals made terrible neighbors. Some actually paid fair prices, understanding that goodwill today meant cooperation tomorrow. Others? Well, they learned the hard way that poisoned wells and sabotaged bridges could ruin an entire campaign. The food itself tells quite a story. Armies preferred dried meat, hardtack bread, and ale that could survive a donkey ride without spoiling. Fresh fruits and vegetables were luxury items, which explains why medieval soldiers had teeth that looked like broken fence posts. Supply trains stretched for miles. Picture this: hundreds of wagons, thousands of pack animals, and enough provisions to stock a modern supermarket. These convoys moved slower than a three-legged horse, making armies vulnerable to enemy raids. Lose your supply train, lose your war. The Crusaders learned this lesson brutally during the siege of Antioch. Their supply lines got cut, and suddenly these holy warriors were eating leather belts and tree bark. Not exactly the glorious campaign they'd signed up for. Then there were the camp followers, merchants, blacksmiths, cooks, and other essential workers who kept the military machine running. These unsung heroes often outnumbered the actual soldiers. Well, all this preparation meant armies moved like giant hungry beasts across the countryside, but feeding the body was only half the battle. These warriors also had to prepare their souls for what might be their final fight. The night before battle, medieval soldiers weren't just sharpening their swords, they were preparing their souls. Religious rituals dominated these final hours, and honestly, you'd probably want divine backup too if you were about to charge into a wall of pointy metal objects wielding nothing but your own pointy metal object. Knights would gather around chaplains for mass confessions. Makes sense, right? When your life expectancy suddenly drops to maybe tomorrow, you want to clear the slate with the big guy upstairs. These weren't quick, forgive me for stealing cookies sessions either. We're talking full-blown spiritual housekeeping that could last hours. Then there's the will-writing marathon. Medieval soldiers treated this like filling out insurance paperwork before a skydiving trip, except the parachute was made of chainmail and prayers. Knights would dictate their final wishes to scribes, dividing up lands, horses, and that fancy sword Uncle Geoffrey left them. Some got surprisingly specific. One documented will from the 100 Years' War includes detailed instructions about who gets the knight's favorite hunting dog. But here's where it gets interesting. These men weren't just wallowing in doom and gloom. Chronicles describe Richard the Lionheart's troops singing battle hymns that echoed across entire camps. Picture a medieval karaoke night, except instead of "Don't Stop Believin'," they're belting out Latin war chants that roughly translate to "God, please don't let me die horribly." The knightly codes of conduct got recited like bedtime stories for adults. Honor, courage, protection of the weak. These weren't just fancy words, but psychological armor against the terror of combat. Veterans would gather younger soldiers, passing down wisdom that boiled down to stick them before they stick you, but do it nobly. Well, some soldiers found creative ways to calm their nerves. Dice games were popular, though gambling your horse away the night before battle seems counterproductive. Others wrote letters home, creating what historians now recognize as some of the most heartfelt correspondence in medieval literature. The weird part is how these rituals actually worked. Modern psychology confirms that pre-performance routines reduce anxiety and improve focus. Medieval warriors figured this out centuries before anyone understood brain chemistry. They knew that facing your mortality head-on somehow made you braver when morning came. And the weird part is, while soldiers were busy preparing their souls and settling earthly affairs, blacksmiths across camp were pulling all-nighters on something equally crucial. But we'll get to those unsung heroes and their race against dawn in just a moment. The blacksmiths were absolutely exhausted by the time dawn broke over the camp. These guys had been hammering away all night, sparks flying like a medieval fireworks show, fixing bent sword blades and patching up dented helmets. Well, someone had to make sure Sir Geoffrey's armor wasn't held together with prayer and wishful thinking. But here's what'll surprise you. Armor inspection wasn't just about checking for holes. Knights had to make sure every single piece fit like a glove, because one loose strap could mean the difference between blocking a sword and becoming a medieval shish kebab. The process took hours. Each knight needed help from at least 2 squires just to get everything on properly. And the weight? Holy moly. A full suit of plate armor weighed between 45 and 55 pounds. That's like carrying a large dog around all day while someone's trying to kill you. Makes your morning jog seem pretty easy, right? Then there's the weapon checks. Swords weren't just sharp, pointy things. They were precision instruments that required constant maintenance. A dull blade was about as useful as a chocolate teapot in battle. Knights would run their fingers along the edges, checking for nicks and chips that could catch on enemy armor at the worst possible moment. Archers had their own nightmare checklist. Every single arrow had to be inspected for straightness because a wobbly arrow flies about as accurately as a drunk pigeon. They'd check fletching, examine arrowheads for cracks, and test bowstrings for fraying. One snap bowstring meant you were basically holding an expensive stick. The really smart commanders organized weapon exchanges between allies. If Sir William had an extra mace but needed a better crossbow, he'd trade with Sir Edmund, who had the opposite problem. It was like medieval eBay, except the reviews were written in blood. What's fascinating is how this equipment ritual boosted confidence. Soldiers who knew their gear was perfect felt invincible. Those with questionable equipment, they spent the whole battle worried their helmet might fall off at the wrong moment. The blacksmiths became celebrities during these inspections. Everyone wanted the master craftsman to personally examine their gear. These guys could spot a hairline crack in a sword blade from 3 feet away, a skill that literally saved lives. But even with all this meticulous preparation, there was still one more crucial element that could make or break everything before the first arrow flew. The way troops moved together determined whether all that perfect equipment would actually matter when chaos erupted. Once weapons were secured and armor fitted, commanders faced their next nightmare, getting hundreds or thousands of men to move as one unified force. You know how hard it is to get 5 friends to agree on where to eat dinner? Try coordinating 5,000 soldiers with medieval-era communication skills. Formation drills weren't just about looking pretty on the battlefield, they were life-or-death choreography. When enemy cavalry charged at full speed, there was no time for, wait, which way do I point my spear again? Every soldier needed to know exactly where to stand, when to move, and how to react without thinking about it. The shield wall was probably the most crucial formation medieval armies practiced. Picture this. Dozens of men standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping like roof tiles. But here's the thing that'll shock you. These weren't just random guys with shields. Each man had to trust the person next to him completely. One soldier breaking formation could create a gap that enemy forces would exploit faster than your neighbor rushing to claim your parking spot. Veterans played a vital role in these training sessions. These grizzled warriors had survived multiple battles, which in medieval times was like having multiple PhD degrees in not dying horribly. They'd position themselves throughout the formation, calling out corrections and sharing battle-tested techniques that couldn't be learned from books. Well, mostly because books were scarce and most soldiers couldn't read anyway. Roman-inspired turtle formations were another crowd favorite. Soldiers would lock shields above their heads and on all sides, creating a mobile fortress. The coordination required was mind-boggling. One mistimed movement and suddenly you're getting a shield to the face from your buddy instead of protection from enemy arrows. but the drilling never stopped with just standing in formation. Units practiced complex maneuvers like wheeling, where entire sections would pivot to face new threats. Think of it as medieval marching band choreography, except instead of disappointing your parents, mistakes got you killed. The repetition was absolutely crucial because battlefield conditions were pure chaos. Smoke, noise, screaming, blood. Not exactly ideal conditions for remembering complicated instructions. Muscle memory developed through endless drilling was often the difference between units that held their ground and units that scattered like leaves in a windstorm. Fresh recruits often struggled with the intensive training regimen. Their muscles ached, their feet blistered, and their pride took a beating from constant corrections. However, what happened during those tense nights before actual combat would test even the most disciplined formations in ways no amount of drilling could prepare them for. The night before battle was like trying to sleep in a house where every floorboard creaks and you're convinced someone's trying to break in. Except in this case, someone actually was. Medieval armies didn't just roll over and catch some beauty sleep after a hard day of marching. Oh no, the darkness brought a whole new level of paranoia that would make modern security guards look relaxed. Sentries were posted every 50 yards around the camp perimeter, armed with torches that flickered like nervous heartbeats against the black sky. But here's what most people don't realize about these nighttime vigils. The real enemy wasn't just surprise attacks, it was the mind games. Enemy forces would deliberately make noise in the distance, just loud enough to keep everyone on edge. Think of it as medieval psychological warfare, but with more mud and significantly worse hygiene. Campfires dotted the landscape like fallen stars, creating pools of light where soldiers huddled together. Not for warmth, mind you, for sanity. The worst part? Nobody could sleep deeply because commanders rotated guard duties every 2 hours. Just when you'd finally drift off, someone would shake your shoulder and hand you a spear. Well, the smart commanders knew that exhausted soldiers make terrible fighters, so they developed a system where only 1/3 of the army stayed awake at any given time. The other 2/3 could rest, though rest is a generous term when you're lying on rocky ground wearing chainmail. Enemy spies were everywhere during these tense nights. They'd crawl through tall grass disguised as peasants or merchants, trying to count troops and spot weaknesses. Getting caught meant instant death, but the information was worth the risk. A single spy could discover that the enemy's left flank was undermanned, or that their supply wagons were poorly guarded. And the weird part is, both sides knew this was happening. Commanders would sometimes plant false information, letting spies overhear conversations about fictional troop movements. It was like playing chess in the dark while someone kept moving the pieces. The most successful night raids in history happened because one side got careless during these vigils. Harold Hardrada's forces were caught off guard before the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, partly because their night watch had grown complacent. Makes sense, right? After days of marching and preparing, the last thing you want is to spend all night jumping at shadows. But those shadows were about to become very real threats, because medieval spies had developed techniques that would surprise even modern intelligence agencies. While everyone thinks medieval battles were just about clashing swords and charging horses, the real action happened in the shadows. Spies were crawling around like medieval cockroaches, gathering secrets that could make or break entire kingdoms. These weren't your Hollywood secret agents with fancy gadgets. We're talking about farmers, merchants, even priests who'd slip into enemy camps pretending to sell bread or offering last rites. One wrong word and they'd end up as human pincushions for crossbow practice. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval spies had tricks that would make modern intelligence agencies jealous. They'd memorize entire battle plans, troop numbers, and supply routes without writing anything down. Why? Because getting caught with evidence meant a particularly creative execution that nobody wanted to experience. The really clever commanders would plant false information on purpose. They'd let a spy overhear fake plans about attacking from the east while secretly preparing to strike from the west. It's like playing poker with someone's life as the stakes. Then there's the interrogation part, which wasn't exactly a polite conversation over tea. Captured enemies were encouraged to share what they knew through methods that would make a dentist visit seem pleasant. Medieval torture devices weren't just for show. They were surprisingly effective at loosening tongues. Some of the best intelligence came from the most unexpected sources. Camp followers, kitchen staff, even the guys cleaning latrines heard things. Nobles loved to gossip, especially when they thought nobody important was listening. Wrong assumption. Women played a bigger role in espionage than most people realize. They could move between camps more easily, offering services or claiming to visit wounded relatives. A pretty face asking innocent questions rarely aroused suspicion among battle-hardened soldiers thinking with something other than their brains. The information gathered could be absolutely game-changing. Knowing that the enemy's left flank was weakened by dysentery or that their supply wagons were 3 days late could turn a hopeless battle into a massacre in your favor. Secret codes weren't uncommon either. Messages hidden in seemingly innocent letters about grain shipments or wedding plans. Medieval cryptography might seem primitive, but it worked well enough to fool enemies who couldn't read anyway. Joan of Arc's remarkable success wasn't just divine inspiration. She had an incredibly effective spy network feeding her enemy movements and weaknesses. Information truly was power, sometimes more valuable than 1,000 knights. Intelligence networks often survived longer than the armies they served, passing secrets between conflicts like some kind of medieval CIA.